The death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 CE did not arrive with thunder or spectacle. It came quietly, like the final exhalation of a tired philosopher who had spent his life balancing power and restraint. Yet the silence that followed was more terrifying than any war cry. Rome, the vast empire of stone roads and iron discipline, passed into the hands of his son Commodus, 19 years old, untested and dangerously intoxicated by the idea of absolute power. Commodus had grown up in the shadow of greatness. His father ruled not as a tyrant, but as a stoic, believing that emperorship was a burden placed upon a man by fate, not a prize to be enjoyed. Marcus Aurelius had taken his son on military campaigns along the Danube, exposing him to the cold discipline of legions and the grim reality of border wars against the Marcomanni and Quadi. Yet Commodus absorbed little of the lesson. Where Marcus saw duty, Commodus saw discomfort. Where soldiers saw survival, Commodus saw boredom. When Marcus died, possibly from plague, possibly from exhaustion, the army immediately proclaimed Commodus emperor. There was no civil war, no debate in the Senate. Rome breathed a sigh of relief. A smooth succession promised stability after decades of struggle. But stability, like wine left unattended, can quickly turn sour. One of Commodus's first acts was to end the Danubian Wars. To the weary legions, this seemed merciful. To the Senate, it was practical. To historians, it was the first sign of decay. Commodus abandoned his father's hard-won strategic advantage, preferring the comfort of Rome to the hardship of the frontier. He returned to the capital in triumph, not as a soldier emperor, but as a young god demanding applause. In Rome, the city welcomed him with festivals, games, and statues. Commodus adored this world. He styled himself not as princeps, first citizen, but as a divine figure. He renamed Rome the Colonia Commodiana, replaced the months of the calendar with his titles, and demanded that statues portray him as Hercules, club in hand, lion's skin draped over his shoulders. The Senate watched in uneasy silence. Mockery could be fatal, obedience was safer. Behind the marble facades, power slipped from Commodus's hands. He had little interest in administration and entrusted the empire to favorites, chamberlains, mistresses, and corrupt officials. Chief among them was Satyrus, a freedman whose influence enraged the aristocracy. Decisions were sold, justice was auctioned, and imperial offices became commodities. Rome was not yet collapsing, but it was rotting. Grain still arrived from Africa, taxes still flowed, yet fear began to replace respect. Commodus's paranoia grew rapidly. Assassination plots, some real, many imagined, fed his cruelty. Senators were executed on whispers. Wealthy families vanished overnight. The empire had survived madmen before, but Commodus was something new, an emperor who loved performance more than power, applause more than authority. And soon, the greatest stage of all, the arena, would consume him. The Roman arena was never merely a place of death, it was a mirror of the empire's soul. Under Commodus, that mirror cracked. What had once been ritualized violence became grotesque spectacle, shaped by an emperor who believed himself immortal. Commodus was obsessed with gladiators. To him, they represented everything he was not, admired, feared, and worshipped by the crowd. Gladiators were slaves or prisoners, yet they commanded more love than senators. This contradiction fascinated Commodus. Soon, fascination became imitation. Against tradition, Commodus began to train as a gladiator. At night, within the safety of the imperial palace, he fought with blunted weapons against carefully chosen opponents, men ordered to lose gracefully. Trainers praised his strength, though the praise was bought with fear. Commodus believed it. He believed he was Rome's greatest warrior. When he finally entered the arena, the rules bent around him like heated wax. Commodus did not fight trained gladiators in fair combat. Instead, he slaughtered wounded soldiers, disabled men, and animals drugged or tied down. He decapitated ostriches and mocked the crowd by holding the severed heads toward the senators' seats, silently reminding them that he could do the same to them. The people cheered, or rather they pretended to. Silence was dangerous. Applause was survival. Commodus styled these performances as divine labor. He claimed over 700 victories, each carefully recorded by imperial scribes. For every appearance, Rome paid, literally. Commodus demanded enormous fees from the state treasury for his gladiatorial displays, draining resources meant for defense and grain. The emperor was bankrupting the empire to celebrate himself. Meanwhile, real wars simmered. Along the frontiers, governors struggled with underfunded legions. In Britain and Dacia, unrest flared. Pirates plagued trade routes. Commodus ignored it all. The empire could burn so long as the arena lights stayed bright. Inside the palace, intrigue thickened like smoke. Commodus cycled through advisors, executing them when paranoia struck. His own sister, Lucilla, once an empress herself, participated in a failed assassination attempt. Commodus survived and responded with merciless purges. Blood spilled not only in the arena, but in marble halls. Yet, despite the terror, Commodus remained convinced of his divinity. He issued decrees referring to himself as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. He renamed the legions after himself. Rome was no longer an empire of laws, it was a stage for one man's delusion. The Senate, humiliated and powerless, waited. So did the Praetorian Guard, watching the treasury empty and discipline erode. History teaches that emperors rarely fall from idealism, they fall from inconvenience. By the end of the 190s, Commodus had become exactly that, an inconvenience too dangerous to tolerate. The question was no longer if he would die, but who would dare to strike first.
Power, when hoarded by fear, begins to rot from the inside. By the early 190s CE, Commodus no longer ruled Rome, he survived it. Every whisper sounded like treason, every shadow like an assassin. The emperor slept lightly, surrounded by guards, charms, and superstition. Rome had become a palace prison, and Commodus its most terrified inmate. The first great threat came not from the Senate, but from blood. Lucilla, Commodus's elder sister and widow of the co-emperor Lucius Verus, had once been an Augusta, an empress in her own right. She had tasted power and could not endure watching Rome degrade under her brother's vanity. Alongside several senators and officers, Lucilla conspired to remove Commodus and restore dignity to the throne. The plot was simple and disastrously arrogant. During a public appearance, an assassin approached Commodus, but instead of striking silently, he announced the act in dramatic fashion, proclaiming that the Senate sent him. Commodus survived. Lucilla did not. She was exiled and later executed. The lesson was clear. Failure meant extinction. After this attempt, Commodus's paranoia hardened into policy. Trials became theater. Accusations required no evidence. Confiscated estates refilled the imperial treasury briefly before being squandered on games and statues. Senators learned to smile, flatter, and remain silent. Survival depended not on loyalty, but invisibility. Yet even fear has limits. Commodus entrusted power to favorites who rose and fell with alarming speed. One of the most powerful was Perennis, a Praetorian prefect who effectively ruled the empire while Commodus played gladiator. Perennis tried to restore discipline, cutting corruption and limiting excess. For a time, Rome stabilized. That stability doomed him. Soldiers in Britain accused Perennis of plotting to place his sons on the throne.
Whether true or fabricated, Commodus believed it. Perennis was executed along with his family. With him died any illusion of competent governance. The Praetorian Guard learned a dangerous truth: emperors could be manipulated with rumors. Next rose Cleander, a former slave whose ambition matched Commodus's madness. Offices were openly sold under his rule. Governors paid bribes. Justice went to the highest bidder. Rome starved while Cleander grew rich. When grain shortages triggered riots, the mob marched on the palace demanding blood. Commodus panicked. Cleander was dragged through the streets and executed. His body was torn apart by the same people who had suffered under him. Commodus watched from safety, shaken but unchanged. Poison followed steel. Several attempts were made to kill Commodus quietly: wine laced with toxins, food prepared by bribed servants. Each attempt failed, either through poor planning or sheer bad luck. Commodus's constitution seemed unnaturally strong, reinforcing his belief that the gods protected him. But fate was patient. By the end of 192 CE, Commodus had isolated himself from everyone except those who profited from his survival. The Senate despised him, the people feared him, the army no longer respected him. Only a few figures remained close enough to strike, and history was drawing them nearer. By the final years of his reign, Commodus no longer pretended to be merely emperor. He had ascended, at least in his own mind, into the realm of gods. What earlier rulers had flirted with cautiously, Commodus embraced with reckless certainty. He was not chosen by the gods, he was one of them. The transformation was deliberate and theatrical. Commodus adopted the persona of Hercules Romanus, the divine hero reborn. He appeared in statues clutching a club, draped in a lion's skin, his youthful face idealized into something eternal. Coins bore his divine titles, temples echoed with his name. Rome itself was reshaped to reflect his fantasy. The city was renamed Colonia Lucia Annia Commodiana. The Senate was retitled. The legions were renamed after him. Even the months of the calendar were altered to honor his divine epithets. It was an attempt not just to rule history, but to overwrite it. For the Senate, this was humiliation beyond endurance. Roman tradition tolerated powerful emperors, even cruel ones, but not self-declared gods who mocked the republic's memory. Yet protest meant death. So senators applauded decrees that erased their own dignity. Religion bent under imperial pressure. Commodus demanded sacrifices in his honor, placing himself alongside Jupiter and Mars. Priests complied. Some believed. Most obeyed. Faith was no longer spiritual, it was political survival. Law, too, dissolved into whim. Commodus ruled through rescripts, personal commands issued without legal precedent. One day, a man could be wealthy and respected, the next executed for a joke overheard by the wrong ear. Fear replaced justice, silence replaced debate. The Praetorian Guard grew uneasy. Discipline eroded as Commodus lavished them with gifts but ignored training and order. Loyalty purchased with gold is temporary. Loyalty earned through respect endures. Commodus understood only the first. Yet to the masses, Commodus remained strangely popular. He fed them games, spectacles, and bread. He fought in the arena, presenting himself as a champion of the people against the arrogant elite. In a society fractured by inequality, this illusion mattered. But illusion cannot repair infrastructure, defend borders, or fill granaries. Behind the pageantry, Rome weakened. Provincial governors struggled without guidance. Military threats simmered beyond the Rhine and Danube. Commodus, absorbed in divine fantasy, remained blind. Even within the palace, loyalty thinned. Servants feared his moods, advisors feared his suspicions. Only a small inner circle remained. Marcia, his favorite concubine, Latus, the Praetorian prefect, and Eclectus, a chamberlain who controlled access to the emperor. They saw what others could not or dare not admit. Commodus was preparing a final transformation. On the first day of the new year, 193 CE, Commodus planned to appear before Rome not as emperor, but as consul, dressed in gladiatorial armor, an act that would shatter every remaining boundary between rule and spectacle. To those closest to him, it was not just madness. It was a death sentence, for Rome or for Commodus himself.
Every empire carries within it seeds of both loyalty and treachery. In Commodus's court, the distinction had long since blurred. The emperor's delusions made him vulnerable, and those closest to him began to consider survival over devotion. By late 192 CE, three figures emerged as pivotal: Marcia, his favored concubine; Laetus, the Praetorian prefect; and Eclectus, the chamberlain who controlled access to the emperor. Marcia had once loved the young, charming Commodus, but years of blood-soaked spectacles, paranoia, and arbitrary cruelty had eroded affection. She saw the empire with clear eyes and recognized that Commodus's obsession with divinity would destroy them all. Her instincts screamed that waiting, watching, and appeasing could not preserve Rome or herself. Laetus was a man of pragmatism. His loyalty to the Praetorian Guard had defined his career. Yet even he knew that an emperor who treated his own soldiers and officers as playthings would eventually destroy both the palace and the city. The army might tolerate bluster and extravagance, but madness disguised as divinity invited collapse. Laetus began to calculate how to contain the emperor or remove him entirely. Eclectus, cunning and subtle, watched everything. His power was invisible but immense. All who wished to see the emperor had to pass through him. All messages, all petitions, all whispers of betrayal filtered through his judgment. He saw the pattern forming. Commodus was playing with death, and the arena would not save him. Together, the three formed an unspoken alliance. The idea of assassination was no longer an abstract discussion. It was a necessity. Rome's survival, their own survival, demanded action. They debated methods: poison, suffocation, direct violence, but always with caution. One mistake, one rumor, one accidental glance could doom them all. Marcia, with her intimate access to the emperor, became the focal point. She alone could approach his private meals, his wine, and his personal routine without arousing suspicion. Slowly, they tested his vulnerability, seeking a method subtle enough to bypass his legendary paranoia. Poison seemed the obvious choice, but rumors of previous attempts, blunted by bad luck or perhaps divine protection, warned them against overconfidence. Meanwhile, Commodus continued his preparations for the new year. He planned to appear in the arena dressed as Hercules, carrying the club of the god hero, expecting to be worshipped not merely as emperor, but as a living deity. Each day he grew more unhinged. Conversations in the palace were met with suspicion. Laughter became a crime, and even his closest advisors could feel the tension crackle like static before a storm. The stakes could not be higher. If Commodus discovered their plotting, all three would face execution. But if they hesitated, Rome itself could fall further into chaos, the frontiers left undefended, the treasury drained, and the city's population starving under both fear and spectacle. The decision was no longer about morality, it was about survival and duty. And so the inner circle moved with quiet determination. Each gesture, each whisper, each plan was measured. The emperor, for all his might, could not perceive the network forming beneath him. The final act was taking shape. It would be a calculated strike, precise and swift, a response to years of misrule, extravagance, and madness. The night of preparation descended over the palace.
Torches flickered on marble walls. The arena awaited. Rome slept, unaware that its fate and the life of its self-proclaimed god was resting in the hands of 3 cautious, determined conspirators. The first day of 193 CE began as any other in Rome, or so it seemed. Commodus, confident in his divine status, prepared for his grand appearance as Hercules, fully armored and wielding his symbolic club. The city, unaware of the storm brewing within the palace, expected spectacle, not tragedy. Yet within the emperor's private chambers, Marcia, Laetus, and Eclectus had taken their positions. Timing was everything. Marcia approached the emperor during his morning meal. The wine, carefully prepared, held a potent mixture of toxins. It was subtle enough that a skilled emperor would not immediately detect it, but deadly in effect. Commodus sipped arrogantly, laughing at imagined rivals and applauding his own reflection in polished mirrors. He believed himself invincible. The gods themselves were on his side. Minutes passed. The poison began its work silently, but Commodus felt no immediate effects. He dismissed mild nausea as fatigue, attributing it to the late-night gladiatorial training he insisted upon. Marcia remained composed, watching his reactions with practiced calm. Her heartbeat quickened only briefly, the weight of impending history pressing upon her. By midday, symptoms intensified. Commodus's face flushed, his movements slowed, and a faint tremor ran through his hands. He tried to rally, calling for his trainers, demanding that the arena be readied. Yet he could not hide the sickness. Panic, rare in the god emperor, crept in. The illusion of divinity faltered. Laetus and Eclectus stood nearby, ready to act if the poison proved insufficient. Their eyes, hidden beneath composed expressions, watched the collapse of a man who once believed himself immortal. The emperor stumbled, and reality struck with cruel clarity. The divine Hercules was mortal all the same. Commodus's final moments were frantic. He demanded water, ordered the guards to restrain him, and raged against the unseen conspirators. Marcia offered comfort disguised as service, but each gesture was deliberate. The poison took its toll. Breath grew shallow, vision blurred, strength abandoned him. The emperor's last roar, meant to summon awe and fear, became a hoarse whisper of disbelief. By evening, Commodus was dead. Rome's longest reign of spectacle and terror had ended in silence, not glory. His body, stripped of the divine trappings he adored, lay still in the imperial chambers. The arena would no longer witness his performances. The city would no longer tremble at his whims. The god emperor was no more. The conspirators moved carefully to contain the aftermath. Rumors of assassination spread quickly through the palace, then to the Senate and Praetorian Guard. Marcia, Laetus, and Eclectus claimed that loyal advisors had discovered Commodus dead of natural causes, though whispers suggested otherwise. Fear of reprisal remained strong. The Praetorian Guard, who had suffered under Commodus's whims, recognized the opportunity, but demanded caution. In the streets, Rome remained oblivious for hours. Merchants continued their trade. Citizens prepared for festivities. Grain shipments arrived as usual. Yet the city had unknowingly passed a threshold. The emperor who had held divine delusions and executed anyone who displeased him was gone. The balance of power, fragile as ever, teetered on the edge. Across the empire, news traveled slowly, but each province felt the ripples. Legions awaited new orders, governors pondered loyalty, and distant threats persisted. The poison that had felled Commodus had done more than kill a man. It had set in motion a chain of political turbulence that would challenge Rome's stability for years to come.
The streets of Rome remained deceptively calm as news of Commodus's death spread. Yet beneath the surface, panic and uncertainty took root. The city had been ruled by a man who was both feared and idolized, and his sudden removal left a void that no single figure could easily fill.
Merchants and citizens whispered cautiously, mindful of how quickly proximity to the palace could become lethal. The empire, vast and complex, now faced a crisis of legitimacy. The Senate convened immediately, though its members were wary. They had long suffered under Commodus's whims, yet the specter of the Praetorian Guard's power loomed larger than ever. Senators debated who might succeed the deceased emperor, balancing legality, tradition, and survival. Some called for a return to the principles of the Principate. Others sought to install a strong man capable of controlling both the palace and the legions, but consensus was elusive. In the Praetorian barracks, tension crackled. The guard, accustomed to Commodus's lavish gifts and erratic commands, now smelled opportunity. Leadership within their ranks shifted as officers maneuvered to ensure their own influence in the coming power struggle. Latus, the prefect, worked cautiously to maintain order, understanding that missteps could lead to open conflict. Discipline, long eroded, had to be managed delicately. Provinces watched Rome's instability with a mixture of anxiety and impatience. Legions along the Danube and Rhine borders awaited orders that would now come from an uncertain authority. Governors debated whether to act independently to secure their regions or to pledge allegiance to whichever successor emerged. Revolts that had been simmering under Commodus's negligence now threatened to ignite fully. Rome's frontiers, already strained, faced renewed danger. Among the populace, reactions were mixed. Some mourned the god-emperor, recalling the spectacles, the games, the illusion of grandeur he had provided. Others, remembering executions, confiscations, and fear, felt relief. The empire had been under a ruler who demanded worship and obedience in equal measure, and now the streets, at least temporarily, experienced a fragile freedom. Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus acted swiftly to consolidate control. They sought to protect themselves from both vengeful supporters of Commodus and ambitious soldiers seeking advantage. Marcia ensured that the palace records were secure, documenting Commodus's excesses while concealing their own involvement. Latus maintained a careful dialogue with the Praetorian Guard, ensuring loyalty through promises and strategic appointments. Eclectus managed communication, guiding the flow of information to minimize panic and rumors. Despite their efforts, Rome's political equilibrium was fractured. Senators plotted quietly, military leaders prepared for potential rebellion, and provincial governors watched for signs of weakness. Commodus's death had not ended the empire's turmoil, it had intensified it. The careful illusion of stability, built over centuries, was suddenly exposed as fragile, contingent on the character of a single man. By the end of the month, the empire was on edge. The vacuum left by Commodus had unleashed a storm of ambitions, fears, and grudges. Rome was a city awaiting direction, an empire balancing on the knife edge between order and chaos. The god-emperor's legacy, once imagined as immortal, now served as a cautionary tale. Power, unchecked and unrestrained, carries within it the seeds of both spectacle and destruction. The death of Commodus set the stage for one of the most chaotic periods in Roman history, the year of the 5 emperors, 193 CE. Without a clear heir, the empire fragmented into competing claims, each backed by different factions of the Senate, the army, and the Praetorian Guard. Rome, accustomed to centralized authority, teetered on the brink of civil war. The first to seize power was Pertinax, a respected senator and former military commander. He was proclaimed emperor by the Senate, seen as a stabilizing figure capable of restoring discipline. Pertinax immediately attempted reforms, aiming to curb the corruption and extravagance left behind by Commodus. He sought to control the Praetorian Guard, reduce imperial excess, and re-establish order. Yet his reforms angered those who had profited under Commodus, including the very guards who were supposed to enforce his authority. The Praetorian Guard, accustomed to bribery and indulgence, rebelled within 3 months, assassinating Pertinax in the imperial palace, shocking the city and sending ripples of fear through Rome. In a grotesque display, they auctioned the emperorship to the highest bidder,
selling the empire like a commodity. Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator, purchased the title, promising gold to the guard. His reign began in scandal, with legitimacy questioned both by the Senate and the legion stationed in distant provinces. At Julianus's authority, generals rejected it. Septimius Severus, commanding legions in Pannonia, marched on Rome, claiming to restore justice and rightful governance. Clodius Albinus and Pescennius Niger, provincial commanders with strong support from their troops, also asserted claims to the throne. Rome itself, stripped of a universally accepted emperor, became a focal point for competing ambitions. Orders and allegiances shifted daily, leaving governors uncertain, citizens fearful, and armies prepared for battle. The rapid succession highlighted the fragility of imperial power without stability. The legions, once instruments of protection, became kingmakers. Provincial loyalty depended less on law or tradition and more on personal allegiance to commanders capable of paying or protecting them. Rome's heart, the Senate, could debate and pontificate, but lacked the ability to enforce decisions without military backing. In the city, rumors ran wild. Merchants worried about the supply of grain, citizens feared arbitrary executions, and former senators of Commodus's court watched cautiously from the sidelines. The palace, once the stage for a single god emperor, now hosted brief and precarious reigns, each more insecure than the last. Political intrigue flourished, alliances formed and dissolved in hours, and the illusion of order shattered. The year of the 5 emperors demonstrated the consequences of an empire governed by spectacle and fear. Commodus's legacy of corruption, extravagance, and divine pretense left a vacuum that could not be filled by tradition alone. The system he had dismantled was brittle, and the ensuing chaos exposed its fragility. Rome's stability depended on strong, legitimate leadership, but the succession crisis made it clear that power could be bought, seized, or lost in the blink of an eye.
The reign of Commodus left an indelible mark on the Roman Empire, a mixture of spectacle, corruption, and instability that historians would debate for centuries. Though some remembered his games and appearances in the arena with fascination, the underlying consequences of his rule were far graver. Commodus's obsession with gladiatorial combat transformed the perception of leadership. An emperor was no longer merely a political and military figure. He could also be a performer, a god on stage, whose authority was validated by spectacle rather than governance. This blurred line weakened traditional structures, making the emperor's whims more dangerous than ever. The Senate, once a stabilizing force, was reduced to a ceremonial audience, powerless in the face of personal vendettas and public theatrics. Corruption thrived under Commodus. Government offices were bought and sold. Justice became a commodity, and loyalty was measured in bribes rather than competence. Prefects like Perennis and Cleander briefly exercised power, but the empire's bureaucracy became a marketplace for favoritism. Resources were drained to fund games, statues, and lavish displays of divine grandeur, leaving provincial administration neglected. Grain shortages, military neglect, and weakened frontier defenses were direct consequences of prioritizing spectacle over statecraft. Provincial unrest and military dissatisfaction grew as a result. Legions stationed on the Danube, Rhine, and in Britain faced neglect. Commanders were forced to pay bribes for recognition or promotion. Revolts, already simmering due to local grievances, became harder to control. Commodus's focus on the city of Rome and personal glorification left the vast empire exposed to both internal and external threats. The emperor's divine pretense further destabilized governance. By styling himself as Hercules, renaming the months and the city, and demanding worship alongside Jupiter and Mars, Commodus undermined centuries of Roman tradition. Religion became politicized. Priests and citizens were coerced into participation.
This manipulation of belief alienated allies and confused the populace, creating long-term distrust in imperial authority. Yet, paradoxically, Commodus did achieve a form of popularity with the masses. The games, spectacles, and bread distributions maintained an illusion of care for the people, even as the empire's foundations were eroding. Commodus's image as a god-emperor masked systemic neglect, making his personal charisma a dangerous veneer over institutional decay. Historians later assessed his rule as the turning point from the stability of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty to the turbulence of the Severan and subsequent periods. The empire's administration, military structure, and succession protocols suffered long-term consequences from his reign. The vacuum left by his death in 192 CE, combined with his preceding mismanagement, set the stage for the year of the five emperors, civil strife, and the eventual rise of stronger military-backed emperors. In retrospect, Commodus's reign is remembered as a cautionary tale. The balance between spectacle and duty, personal ambition and civic responsibility was catastrophically mismanaged. The emperor who believed himself a god ultimately proved mortal, but the empire he ruled would feel the reverberations of his excess, paranoia, and theatrical madness for decades. The death of Commodus and the chaos that followed left an indelible impression on Rome's collective memory. For ordinary citizens, his reign was a mixture of terror and amusement. They recalled the spectacles, the gladiatorial contests, and the emperor's strange appearances as Hercules with a sense of wonder, yet also with relief that the era of unpredictability had ended. Fear had been an omnipresent companion. The streets of Rome, once dangerous under arbitrary executions, now offered a fragile freedom. Soldiers who had served under Commodus experienced the consequences of his obsession firsthand. Legions stationed along the Danube and Rhine recalled supply shortages, neglect, and the eccentricity of an emperor more concerned with his image than their welfare. Yet they also remembered the emperor who fought in the arena, sometimes providing them with moments of awe or inspiration. In retrospect, these performances highlighted a tension between spectacle and military discipline, a tension that would inform their expectations of future commanders. The Praetorian Guard, which had once wielded power through Commodus's favoritism and corruption, emerged both triumphant and wary. They had facilitated the emperor's removal, but they understood that their authority could easily be challenged. The Guard's influence in subsequent years grew, setting a precedent for future interventions in succession. Their actions during the assassination and the immediate aftermath of 192 CE became both a lesson and a warning in military politics. Historians and chroniclers, from Cassius Dio to Herodian, captured Commodus in a complex light. He was remembered as cruel, capricious, and self-indulgent, yet also as a figure whose reign illuminated human tendencies toward hubris and spectacle. Stories of his gladiatorial performances, his vanity, and his divine claims became moral anecdotes, emphasizing the dangers of absolute power untempered by reason, the fragility of governance, and the vulnerability of an empire to a single ruler's whims. In literature, Commodus's image evolved into legend. The line between fact and myth blurred. Tales of his fights in the arena, the decapitation of animals, and the intimidation of senators were recounted for generations. Children heard exaggerated stories, soldiers whispered rumors, and the Senate's records reflected both factual events and interpretive moral lessons. Commodus became emblematic of the emperor who mistook personal power for divinity, and the emperor whose indulgence heralded instability. For Rome itself, the empire's identity endured through these reflections. Citizens, soldiers, and historians learned to navigate the tension between reverence and vigilance. Commodus's reign served as a reminder that imperial authority could be both awe-inspiring and destructive. Festivals and arenas continued, but a new consciousness informed how power was perceived, questioned, and held accountable. The echoes of Commodus persisted in political culture. Military loyalty, Senate authority, and civic obedience were all recalibrated in response to the lessons of his reign. The emperor, who had styled himself as Hercules, remained a cautionary figure, a symbol of the extremes of ego, spectacle, and misgovernance. Through the eyes of Romans then and later, the story of Commodus illuminated the delicate balance required to govern an empire and the high cost of losing that balance.
Commodus's fascination with the arena transformed Rome's understanding of spectacle and authority. To him, the gladiatorial games were not merely entertainment, they were political theater, a display of dominance that reinforced his divine image. The city witnessed unprecedented excesses as Commodus both staged and participated in the bloody contests. In the Colosseum, he appeared dressed as Hercules, his muscles exaggerated, the lion's skin draped over his shoulders. Citizens, accustomed to gladiatorial contests, stared in awe and fear. To the masses, Commodus embodied both the thrill of the games and the authority of the emperor. To senators and patricians, the performances were grotesque and humiliating, a reminder that political influence had been subordinated to personal spectacle. Commodus's participation altered the dynamics of the arena. Traditional rules were bent or abandoned. Gladiators, often seasoned warriors, were forced to act as foils for the emperor, ensuring that he appeared invincible. Animals, from ostriches to exotic beasts, were slaughtered in elaborate displays, demonstrating both cruelty and the emperor's supposed prowess. Each act reinforced his divine persona while simultaneously draining the treasury. Funding for these events far exceeded what was sustainable for the empire. The political function of the games was clear. Spectacle became a tool to command loyalty and suppress dissent. Citizens, distracted by blood and pageantry, remained entertained, allowing Commodus to consolidate power without relying on reasoned governance. Fear coexisted with fascination, as audiences recognized the peril inherent in witnessing a man who could transform amusement into execution. The emperor's control of narrative was absolute. He staged himself as god, champion, and judge, all in one performance. Beyond Rome, the extravagance strained the empire's resources. Grain and funds allocated to provincial administration were diverted to finance games, gifts to the Praetorian Guard, and arena maintenance. Governors struggled to balance local needs with imperial demands, often facing rebellion or unrest as a result. Soldiers stationed at borders watched the capital indulge in decadence while they endured shortages and dangerous postings. Historically, Commodus's gladiatorial obsession has been interpreted as a symptom of his broader misrule. His focus on personal glory and public theater came at the expense of administration, military discipline, and justice. The games, while temporarily captivating, masked systemic failures, corruption, neglected frontiers, and weakened institutions. Yet the games also reflected a fundamental aspect of Roman culture, the intersection of politics and spectacle. Emperors had long used festivals, public rituals, and gladiatorial events to demonstrate power. Commodus's extremity highlighted both the potential and peril of this tactic. The arena became a lens through which the tensions between authority, entertainment, and morality were magnified. In the final analysis, the gladiatorial obsession of Commodus offers insight into the psychology of power. By placing himself at the center of blood-soaked theater, he sought both approval and awe, control and validation.
The empire, for all its size and structure, became a stage upon which the emperor could perform divinity, oblivious to the long-term decay he fostered. Commodus's court was a labyrinth of favoritism, ambition, and danger. Freedmen and personal favorites rose to unprecedented positions of influence, leveraging their proximity to the emperor to manipulate governance. Among the most notable were Sauterus, Perennis, and Cleander, each demonstrating the volatility and corruption of imperial administration under a ruler more interested in personal glorification than duty. Sauterus, a freedman and chamberlain, initially gained influence due to his personal access to Commodus. He manipulated appointments and decisions, enriching himself and his allies. The Senate and traditional aristocracy resented him, yet fear of the emperor's wrath prevented overt action. Sauterus's dominance exemplified how proximity to power, rather than merit or law, dictated influence in Commodus's Rome. Perennis, appointed Praetorian prefect, sought to stabilize the administration. He controlled military appointments and provincial governance, often correcting errors left by Commodus's neglect. For a time, he appeared to be the de facto ruler, maintaining order in the emperor's absence. Yet his power threatened both the emperor and the Senate. Accusations of plotting against Commodus, whether true or fabricated, led to his execution, illustrating the precariousness of authority under a paranoid ruler. Cleander, another freedman, capitalized on the vacuum of discipline that followed Perennis's death. He sold offices, arranged lucrative contracts, and amassed personal wealth at the expense of the state. While Rome's infrastructure and provinces suffered, Cleander's influence grew, demonstrating how corruption flourished under an emperor distracted by spectacle and self-deification. When public unrest erupted due to grain shortages, Cleander's removal and brutal execution were orchestrated by the very populace he had ignored, highlighting the volatility of courtly power and the emperor's dependence on popular perception. Commodus's reliance on favorites destabilized the Senate and bureaucracy. Senators were marginalized, their authority undermined by individuals who had no accountability beyond pleasing the emperor. Law became personal, justice arbitrary. Decisions that affected provinces, taxation, and military command were often dictated by whim or bribery. The imperial court, intended to be a center of governance, became a theater of intrigue and survival. Paranoia compounded the chaos. Commodus's fear of conspiracy led to frequent executions, property confiscations, and the shifting of offices. Even long-serving advisors lived under constant threat. Freedmen who once wielded enormous power were suddenly vulnerable, as the emperor's suspicion rotated with each perceived slight. Trust became a rare commodity. Loyalty was transactional and fleeting. This environment of favoritism and corruption had profound consequences. Provinces were neglected, legions were underpaid or mismanaged, and the treasury was depleted by extravagances and misappropriations. Administrative competence was sacrificed to personal loyalty, and institutional memory eroded. The empire became increasingly dependent on ad hoc decisions, improvisation, and the caprice of one man.
As Commodus's reign progressed, his paranoia deepened. Every glance, every whisper, and every gesture could be interpreted as treason. Senators, generals, and advisors lived under constant threat. Even those closest to the emperor were not safe. Commodus's mental state deteriorated, a combination of absolute power, delusion, and fear that made him increasingly isolated and unpredictable. Executions became commonplace. Senators accused of plotting, whether real or imagined, were swiftly dispatched. Wealthy families were stripped of property and titles, their influence erased overnight.
Courtiers who once wielded power as favorites found themselves powerless, their past influence irrelevant in the emperor's paranoid calculus. Each act of elimination reinforced his sense of divine protection, yet simultaneously deepened his isolation. The emperor's suspicion extended to friends and family. Lucilla's earlier conspiracy had left a lasting scar, and Commodus distrusted even those who had once shown loyalty. Advisors were rotated or removed frequently. Trusted confidants were executed to prevent imagined betrayal. The administration became a revolving door, and continuity of governance suffered. Isolation intensified the emperor's delusions. He increasingly identified with Hercules, seeing threats as monstrous adversaries in a cosmic battle. Advisors and guards were no longer just people, they were potential conspirators or mythical enemies. The line between reality and imagination blurred, making every decision a reflection of fear rather than reason. Courtiers adapted by curtailing their counsel to appease his ego, further disconnecting the emperor from practical governance. The psychological toll of paranoia manifested in both public and private behavior. Commodus appeared erratic in public, indulging in gladiatorial displays while punishing minor slights with disproportionate severity. In private, he oscillated between grandiosity and anxiety, seeking reassurance from Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus, while simultaneously mistrusting them. This created a tense equilibrium. The inner circle had to balance flattery, obedience, and careful manipulation to maintain their own safety and influence. The emperor's obsession with control exacerbated the empire's instability. Fear-driven decisions led to abrupt policy shifts, unpredictable military commands, and erratic taxation. Provincial governors and military commanders were left uncertain about expectations, weakening frontier defenses and administrative oversight. Commodus's isolation, combined with paranoia, directly contributed to the empire's growing vulnerability. By 192 CE, the emperor's court had become a microcosm of fear and intrigue. Commodus, surrounded by those who both feared and manipulated him, had effectively isolated himself from rational counsel. The Praetorian Guard, Senate, and provincial administration were all constrained by the ripple effects of his suspicion. Trust, loyalty, and expertise were secondary to survival, leaving the empire in a precarious position. This climate set the stage for his eventual assassination. Commodus's paranoia, fear of betrayal, and isolation created both motive and opportunity for those closest to him. The very structures that had protected the emperor, his favorites, guards, and advisors, became the instruments of his demise. Fear had become a weapon, and the emperor's obsession with control paradoxically made him vulnerable to those he trusted most. By late 92 CE, the inner circle, Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus, had resolved that action was necessary. Commodus's erratic behavior, obsession with divinity, and disregard for both the army and administration made him a danger not only to themselves, but to the empire itself. The conspirators carefully plotted, aware that any misstep could lead to their deaths. Marcia, closest to the emperor in both intimacy and daily routine, was the key to any plan. Her access to Commodus's meals and wine provided an opportunity to administer poison discreetly. Yet experience and caution dictated that the initial attempts be tested. With careful observation for reactions, timing was crucial. Any sign of detection could trigger immediate retaliation. Latus, as Praetorian prefect, oversaw security and the soldiers surrounding the emperor. He ensured that trusted guards could intervene if Commodus grew suspicious or violent. His presence provided the conspirators with a controlled environment, limiting the risk of intervention by rogue factions or unaligned soldiers. The prefect coordinated with Eclectus to monitor all palace entrances and communication, preventing leaks or rumors from undermining the plan. Eclectus, whose control of access to the emperor was unmatched, managed both timing and subtle signals. He guided Marcia through when and how to approach, ensuring that every gesture appeared natural. The plan required precision. The poison had to act effectively without arousing immediate suspicion, and Commodus's public appearances could not be disrupted until the effects were confirmed. The conspirators considered alternatives: suffocation, stabbing, and other forms of direct violence. Yet the poison was deemed safest, allowing a controlled end that minimized the risk of immediate detection and potential panic among the Praetorian Guard or the populace. The plan also relied on psychological advantage. Commodus's belief in his divine protection made him less likely to suspect the actions of someone so intimate and trusted. Preparation took days. Marcia secured the ingredients, ensured the proper dosage, and practiced routine interactions to avoid alarming the emperor. Latus coordinated timing with the guard, while Eclectus monitored the palace environment for threats or distractions. The conspirators rehearsed scenarios in which the emperor might react violently, planning contingencies to protect both themselves and the palace. Finally, the decisive moment approached. Commodus, ever confident and vain, indulged in his morning routine, unaware of the lethal threat he faced. Marcia approached with poise, offering wine as part of their ritualistic mourning, while Latus and Eclectus maintained subtle oversight. Every gesture, every glance, and every word was calibrated to maintain composure and avoid detection. In these moments, the tension was palpable. The emperor's delusion of divinity, his paranoia, and the conspirators' careful execution created a charged atmosphere. The plan had to succeed. Failure meant not only the emperor's wrath, but a collapse of order in the palace. Years of misrule, extravagance, and cruelty had led to this singular moment where survival, justice, and duty intersected with intrigue and careful planning. The stage was set. Rome, unaware of the precise maneuverings within the palace, continued its life outside. The city would witness the end of a god emperor, but only through the carefully orchestrated acts of those he trusted most.
On the morning of December 31st, 192 CE, Commodus prepared for his morning routines, still confident in his divine invincibility. Draped in garments reminiscent of Hercules, he carried himself with arrogance, oblivious to the meticulous plotting surrounding him. Marcia approached with a steady hand and calm demeanor, offering the emperor his morning wine. Every detail had been rehearsed. The poison's potency and timing were calculated with precision. Commodus sipped the wine, laughing at imagined rivals and recalling past glories in the arena. At first, there were no visible effects. He mocked his reflection, flexing in the mirror, unaware that mortality had quietly entered his body. Marcia watched, composed, while Latus and Eclectus maintained subtle vigilance, ready to intervene if the emperor detected foul play. Minutes passed, then symptoms began. Commodus's face flushed, his muscles twitched, and nausea crept through his body. Confusion and fear flickered in his eyes, a sensation unfamiliar to one who had long considered himself godlike. He demanded explanations, called for his guards, and tried to rally his strength, yet the poison worked silently, insidiously, leaving him weakened and vulnerable. The emperor's final moments were a mixture of panic and disbelief. He attempted to summon the courage and fury of Hercules, imagining himself impervious to harm. His voice, once commanding and godlike, became a strained whisper. The inner circle remained composed. Their careful preparation ensured no sudden movements would trigger retaliation. With each labored breath, the aura of divinity that Commodus had cultivated dissolved, replaced by the undeniable reality of human mortality. By late morning, Commodus could no longer stand. Marcia remained close, ostensibly offering comfort, while Latus and Eclectus observed from discreet distances. The emperor, whose life had been a theater of blood, spectacle, and fear, now lay defeated by subtle cunning rather than brute force. The god emperor had fallen. The immediate aftermath in the palace was tense. Guards were kept in disciplined observation, preventing rumor or panic from spreading. Marcia ensured that the scene appeared as natural as possible, while Latus managed communications with the Praetorian Guard. Eclectus controlled the flow of information to avoid destabilizing the capital.
The conspirators' actions were precise, minimizing risk and maintaining a fragile order. Outside the palace, Rome remained largely unaware. Citizens went about their routines, merchants conducted business, and grain shipments continued as usual. Yet the death of the emperor set in motion profound shifts in power. Senators whispered cautiously, plotting new alignments, while provincial governors and generals readied themselves for the ensuing scramble of authority. The fall of Commodus marked an era defined by spectacle, corruption, and divine pretension. The city had survived, yet the empire stood on the precipice of civil conflict. The assassination achieved its immediate goal, removing a dangerous, erratic ruler, but it also unleashed uncertainty and instability as the vacuum left by the god emperor invited ambition, intrigue, and the struggle for succession. In this singular act, the delicate balance of Rome was reshaped. The god who had walked among men, fought as Hercules, and commanded fear and admiration alike, had met his mortal end. And yet, the reverberations of his reign, his misrule, his extravagance, and his obsession with spectacle would echo through history, a cautionary tale of power, hubris, and the fragility of empire. With Commodus dead, Rome entered a period of uncertainty and rapid maneuvering. The Senate, long subservient and humiliated by the god emperor, convened cautiously. Senators debated the future, wary of both the Praetorian Guard and provincial generals. Any miscalculation could lead to open conflict or personal execution. The emperor was gone, but the empire's stability remained fragile. The Praetorian Guard, whose power had expanded under Commodus, recognized both opportunity and danger. They had facilitated his removal and now controlled access to imperial authority. Their loyalty was transactional, influenced by bribes, promises, and fear. Officers jockeyed for influence, ensuring that the succession would favor those willing and able to pay or negotiate with the Guard. In this vacuum, Rome's political center teetered precariously. Provincial governors and legions also faced uncertainty. Legions in Pannonia, Britain, and along the Danube had long awaited orders from a central authority. But now, with the emperor gone and communication delayed, commanders considered their own options. Some declared allegiance to potential successors, while others awaited the emergence of a strong figure to restore order. Revolts and unrest, previously suppressed, threatened to flare in regions neglected under Commodus's indulgent and distracted reign. Into this chaos emerged Severus, commanding legions in Pannonia. Recognizing the opportunity presented by the vacuum of power, Severus moved swiftly. He consolidated support among loyal legions, securing supplies, fortifying positions, and communicating his intent to restore stability. Meanwhile, rivals such as Clodius Albinus in Gaul and Pescennius Niger in the east mobilized their forces, setting the stage for conflict over imperial succession. Within Rome, the Senate attempted to assert influence, but the rapid mobilization of Severus's forces and the Praetorian Guard's transactional authority limited their effectiveness. Orders and decrees carried little weight without military enforcement. Citizens, merchants, and provincial administrators watched nervously as political intrigue and military readiness intertwined. The city itself experienced an uneasy calm. Life continued outwardly normally, but the underlying tension was palpable. Grain shipments, trade, and festivals persisted, yet the empire's cohesion depended on the decisions of a few key generals and the responsiveness of the Guard. The fragility of Rome's central authority, exposed during Commodus's reign, now became a critical vulnerability. Severus's advance towards Rome, backed by disciplined legions, demonstrated the shift in power from senatorial privilege to military authority. The empire, once guided by tradition and law, now relied heavily on the loyalty of armed forces. Commodus's death had highlighted the dangers of absolute power in a single ruler, and the subsequent scramble for succession emphasized the necessity of capable leadership. By the end of 193 CE, Severus Severus emerged as the dominant figure, claiming imperial authority, and began the consolidation of power that would stabilize the empire. Yet the empire remained forever altered. Commodus's reign, with its spectacle, corruption, and mismanagement, had left deep scars. The lessons of fear, governance, and military reliance would shape the trajectory of Rome for decades to come, proving that even the fall of a god emperor could not immediately restore balance without strong, pragmatic leadership.
The death of Commodus marked not only the end of an emperor, but the conclusion of the Antonine era, a period once characterized by relative stability, administrative competence, and succession by capable heirs. Commodus, in contrast, had epitomized the hazards of absolute power, mingled with personal vanity, divine pretense, and indulgent spectacle. Historians later reflected on the emperor's reign as a turning point. The Nerva Antonine dynasty, which had produced rulers celebrated with wisdom, military skill, and attention to civic order, ended with a ruler consumed by ego and delusion. The Senate's authority was undermined, the bureaucracy destabilized, and provincial administration neglected. Corruption flourished, and the Praetorian Guard acquired unprecedented influence, demonstrating how favoritism and personal ambition could shape imperial outcomes. Commodus's gladiatorial obsession and public displays captivated Rome, but drained both resources and governance. The Colosseum became a stage upon which the emperor performed divinity, exercising control over citizens and senators alike. Yet behind the spectacle, the empire's frontiers weakened, grain supplies dwindled, and military discipline suffered. The illusion of divine rule obscured systemic decay, masking vulnerabilities that would resurface after his death. The assassination, orchestrated by Marcia, Latus, and Eclectus, highlighted the tension between survival, justice, and governance. Their careful planning demonstrated that even the most feared god emperor could be brought down by prudence, intelligence, and precise action. In removing Commodus, they not only preserved themselves, but also prevented further destabilization that might have escalated beyond repair. The empire, immediately following his death, faced the Year of the Five Emperors, civil unrest, and provincial uncertainty. The swift rise of Septimius Severus, backed by disciplined legions, restored a measure of stability, yet underscored the shift from traditional senatorial authority to military power. Rome had learned at great cost that unchecked personal rule could imperil centuries of institutional strength. Citizens, soldiers, and historians all internalized lessons from Commodus's reign. Popular memory preserved stories of his cruelty, spectacle, and self-deification alongside the cautionary narratives of court intrigue, paranoia, and mismanagement. Future emperors would navigate these histories carefully, balancing personal ambition with the responsibilities of governance. The legend of the Gladiator Emperor endured, a symbol of both fascination and warning. Ultimately, the fall of Commodus and the subsequent transition to the Severan dynasty illustrate the fragility of power, the impact of personal character on an empire, and the enduring importance of competent leadership. Rome had survived the spectacle, corruption, and delusion of a god emperor, but the empire had been irrevocably altered. The lessons of this era, the dangers of hubris, the costs of spectacle, and the necessity of prudence in governance resonated throughout the centuries. Thus, the Antonine era closed with the death of Commodus, giving way to a new chapter defined by military pragmatism, succession struggles, and the ongoing challenge of maintaining a vast and diverse empire. History remembered both the marvel and the tragedy, the blood and the theater,
the lessons of power abused, and the resilience of Rome itself.